Hello, and welcome to the book of Ezra-Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah are going to give us the final events of biblical history. Congratulations, by the way, on making it to the end of biblical history. But backing up first, we learned that Israel had proven to be irredeemably rebellious during the period of kings, and therefore the curses of the covenant and the warnings of the prophets came true, and they landed in exile. Now, by the time Ezra chapter 1, verse 1 shows up, Israel has been in exile for about 70 years. Let's take a look at that opening verse of Ezra. Ezra 1:1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus that he made a proclamation. Now, this proclamation was that Israel can return home from exile. They can go back to their inheritance. And isn't it interesting that this book opens with a hyperlink back to the prophets, in this case, to Jeremiah. It does it explicitly to Jeremiah, but it links also back to Isaiah as well when it mentions Cyrus by name. So here we are. We're on the other side of exile. And Ezra-Nehemiah is going to give us 100 years of history on that side of exile. And honestly, it's pretty confusing. I mean, 100 years of history in 3 separate turns. What makes everything better? A chart. Come and take a look at the chart I made. Here is really a fancy timeline. The timeline is going to begin, I know you can't read this, in 539. This is Ezra 1:1 with the Edict of Cyrus saying they could return. And then the timeline all the way down here in 430 is Nehemiah's second term as governor. So this covers the entire history of Ezra-Nehemiah. To the left of the timeline is going to be content back in Persia. So here are the successive kings of Persia. And then you'll recognize a couple of characters here. Daniel is going to be in Persia during the reign of Cyrus, Cambyses, and the first year at least of Darius. And then, of course, Esther was the queen of Xerxes. But we are more interested in what is here on the right side of the timeline. This is the material, the content back in Judah. So this content we can divide into 4 different periods. So the first period is the reconstruction of the temple, 23 years. The second period it's this lengthy period, 57 years of silence. Ezra-Nehemiah doesn't record anything that happens during this time, with a slight exception. And then we have the ministry of Ezra, starting in year 458, and the ministry of Nehemiah with the reconstruction of the walls in 444. Let's take a slightly closer look at each of these 4 sections. So this is all of Ezra 1 to 6. The reconstruction period is Ezra 1 to 6. It's going to begin in 1 and 2 with the call to return, and then in 3, beginning of 3, they're going to rebuild the altar, they're going to rebuild the foundation, but then there's going to be a 16-year delay where there's opposition and the construction stops. And all this is going to stop until the prophets Haggai and Zechariah begin their prophetic ministry. And I want to show you how Ezra highlights this in 5:1. So this is a bunch of opposition was taking place. The work on the house of God stopped in chapter 4. But in chapter 5, thanks to the ministry of Haggai and Zechariah, who prophesied to the Jews, Zerubbabel and Jeshua began to rebuild the house of God. So that's good. And the temples are going to be completed in the year 515. And now we move on to this period of silence. And there's only a couple of things that we can really speculate as taking place during this period. First, the prophetic ministry of Malachi. We think that took place during these 57 years because the temple had been completed by the time of Malachi. We know that, although it was neglected, they offered polluted offerings, and some of the similar kind of community sins that are addressed in Ezra are also addressed in Malachi. The second thing that we know took place during this period of silence is this really random letter in Ezra chapter 4. Now let me jump over here for you. Ezra chapter 4 is a little bit difficult. Chapter 4. It is, for better or for worse, out of order. Now let me show you what I mean by that. It's out of order. Let's go to chapter 4. So Ezra 4, 1-5, this is all going to be, it's going to talk about the opposition to the rebuilding of the temple. And this took place during the reigns of Cyrus and Darius. But then in verse 6, it's going to jump down to the reign of Ahasuerus, and that is many, many years in the future. See this? There's Cyrus, Darius, and then it's going to jump all the way down to Ahasuerus down here. And then the very next verse in verse 7, it's going to jump down to in the days of Artaxerxes. And that's going to jump down even further down here. I can zoom out, kind of make this more clear. So this is Ezra 4, 1-5, and then it's going to jump to 4, 6, and it's going to jump all the way down here to 4, 7. So it's a little bit complicated, but that is Ezra chapter 4. The third kind of period during these 100 years is the ministry of Ezra. And even though the book is called Ezra, Ezra the person is not going to show up on the scene until chapter 7. And chapters 7 and 8 are going to record his return to Judah. And then chapters 9 and 10 are going to talk about his conflict with intermarriage that the Jews were practicing at that time. And all of this, it's kind of strange, all of this is going to take place during one calendar year, Ezra 7 to 10. And then there's going to be like a 13-year gap again before Nehemiah shows up in 444. And Nehemiah 1 to 12 is all going to take place during two calendar years. And it's going to follow a similar pattern where he's commissioned to come back and return. He is to rebuild the walls. He faces opposition, and he completes his building project. And then there's another kind of gap of 12 years, during which time Nehemiah serves as governor, but it doesn't really say anything about that period. He is required to return to Persia. He's the cupbearer in 432, and then he comes back, we think, in the year 430 for his second term as governor, and that term is covered in Nehemiah chapter 13, a very important chapter, and the final chapter of Ezra-Nehemiah. So that is our historical overview. I'd like to turn now to the structure of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, so the first thing to realize with a discussion about the structure of Ezra and Nehemiah is that it is, in fact, Ezra and Nehemiah and not Ezra and Nehemiah. It is a single book, and the single book is can be divided into two parts. Ezra 1 to Nehemiah 7a, and then the rest of Nehemiah in part 2. So the first part of Ezra and Nehemiah is the return and rebuild section. And there's going to be 3 waves of returning to the land and rebuilding, a different rebuilding project. So in 538, Zerubbabel is going to return to rebuild the temple. And then in 458, Ezra is going to return to rebuild the Torah. Now, what does it mean to rebuild the Torah? Let me show you a couple of verses that kind of explain that a bit. So we're rebuilding the Torah. That is Ezra's commission. He's commissioned by Artaxerxes to rebuild the temple, and this is kind of what we mean by that. In verse 14, Artaxerxes says, "You are sent by the king to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law, according to the Torah, according to the law of your God, which is in your hand." And down at verse 25, you, Ezra, are to appoint judges and magistrates that are to judge the people according to the laws of your God. Again, Torah. Whoever will not obey the law of your God is to be judged. So that is our rebuilding project for Ezra. He's commissioned to rebuild the Torah. And then finally in 444, Nehemiah is called by Artaxerxes to rebuild the walls. Now what's interesting about this first section, these three waves, is that they follow a similar pattern, a similar cycle. And here in purple is the cycle that each of these three waves follows. So they're going to begin with a commission by a Persian king. Zerubbabel's commissioned by Cyrus and Artaxerxes for the following two. And then that return is going to be depicted in New Exodus imagery. And we'll talk about what that means in a following lecture. And then when they do return, they begin to rebuild, they're going to face opposition. Each of these leaders are going to face opposition. But then, after the completion of their rebuilding project, the story is going to leave you with this kind of disappointing sense of anticlimax. Each of these stories contains an element of disappointment, of anticlimax. So that is the first section, the first part of Ezra-Nehemiah. The second part, in Nehemiah 7b to 13, this is what we're calling reform and regress. The reform section is from 7 through 12, and regress is here in 13. Now, this is going to begin with a list here, and the list, it's this long list in Nehemiah 7. It's a list of returned exiles. Let me spell it out for you. Returned exiles. 67 verses, and what's kind of strange is that this list is repeated exactly from Ezra chapter 2. Same exact list, word for word. And it's going to be flanked, this first section is flanked by another set of lists, two lists. The first list are those who volunteered to reside within the rebuilt Jerusalem, and then the second list is another list of Levites and priests. And this section here is going to conclude with the dedication of the temple, the dedication of the walls and the joy of the people. So let me show you joy. There you go. That's the joy of the people. Dedication and joy. And what's funny is that it's going to match exactly the dedication of the temple and the joy of the people here at the end of Ezra 1 to 6. And it's going to use the same Hebrew words for dedication and joy. Now we're going to notice a lot of parallels between these two sections, and this is just the first of those with the joy of the people. So these other two sections are going to be, they're going to contain as well a series of cycles. And this entire section is the high point of Ezra and Nehemiah. In Nehemiah 8 to 12, there's going to be this grand Torah reading marathon where Ezra is going to get on top of this box. He's going to open up the Torah. He's going to read it to the people, and everyone's going to be like, all right, we're going to obey. We promise we're going to obey. And that's wonderful. It's really the high point of the book. But then in chapter 13, all of the promises that they made here are going to be systematically broken one after the other. And that's how the book ends. So we're going to take a look at the next two lectures. First at part 1, return and rebuild, and then at part 2, reform and regress.